I always knew my sister Victoria would find a way to make Christmas about herself, but I never imagined she'd convince our parents to throw my belongings onto the front lawn while the neighbors watched. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in holiday traditions and justified by family loyalty. What happened next didn't just change that snowy December evening, it transformed our entire family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 weeks before Christmas, disguised as a perfectly innocent phone call from my mother. I was grading papers in my cramped Hartford apartment, red pen in hand, when Catherine Rivers' voice filled my small living room through the speaker. "Amanda, darling," she began, her tone carrying that particular blend of warmth and manipulation I'd learned to recognize over my 28 years. "I wanted to discuss Christmas arrangements before things get too hectic." I set down my pen, already feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach that accompanied most conversations with my family. Outside my window, December rain drummed against the glass, the gray afternoon matching my suddenly dampened mood. "Of course, Mom. What's on your mind?" "Well, Victoria and Jonathan have such exciting news to share this year. The partnership at the firm, the new house in Millbrook Heights, and she's been working so hard on the charity auction committee. Your father and I thought it would be wonderful to make this Christmas extra special for them." The subtext was clear, as it always was with my mother. Victoria's achievements were worth celebrating. Mine apparently were not. As a social worker helping troubled teens in Hartford's inner city, my accomplishments rarely registered on the Rivers family radar of success. "That sounds lovely," I managed, though my voice probably betrayed more resignation than enthusiasm. "I'm so glad you understand, sweetheart. Now, about sleeping arrangements." Catherine's voice took on that brisk, efficient tone she used when discussing logistics. "With Victoria and Jonathan staying in Victoria's old room, and your cousin, Michael, bringing his new girlfriend from Boston, we're a bit tight on space this year." I waited, knowing there was more coming. "We were thinking you might be more comfortable staying at that charming little bed and breakfast downtown, the Millbrook Inn. It's quite lovely this time of year, and it would give you some independence. You know how you value your space." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. In all my years, I had never been asked to stay anywhere but the family home during Christmas. Even when I'd brought Daniel last year, they'd managed to find room for us both, albeit in the basement guest room that smelled faintly of mildew. "Mom, I don't understand. I've always stayed at home for Christmas. It's tradition." "Oh, darling, traditions evolve. Besides, it's not like you'll be missing anything important. You'll be there for Christmas Eve dinner and Christmas morning, of course. It's just sleeping arrangements." The casual dismissal in her voice stung more than outright hostility would have. This was worse than being rejected. I was being erased, made irrelevant with the kind of polite efficiency my mother had perfected through years of social climbing in Millbrook's elite circles. "What does Dad think about this?" I asked, grasping for some ally in the family hierarchy. "Your father agrees completely. He's been so stressed with year-end numbers at the firm, and having a peaceful, organized household will be better for everyone. You understand." I understood perfectly. Robert Rivers, my father, had built his identity around success, order, and maintaining the family's reputation in Millbrook's exclusive social scene. My presence, with my second-hand clothes and my career helping society's forgotten children, didn't fit the polished image they wanted to project during their holiday entertaining. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. "Of course, take your time. But do let me know soon. I need to make reservations, and the inn fills up quickly during the holidays." After hanging up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, the stack of ungraded papers forgotten. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "How was your day? Excited for Christmas break?" I stared at his message for a long time before responding. Daniel Martinez had been my anchor for the past 2 years, a graphic designer whose warm Cuban family had welcomed me with open arms during our relationship. His Christmas traditions involved chaos, laughter, and genuine affection, concepts that felt increasingly foreign when contrasted with my own family's sterile performances. "Family stuff," I typed back. "Tell you when you get home." Daniel had been working late on a project for a nonprofit client, another example of how our values aligned in ways my family couldn't understand. While Victoria chased corporate partnerships, and my parents pursued social status, Daniel and I found meaning in work that actually mattered, even if it didn't come with impressive salaries or prestigious addresses. The next few days passed in a blur of work and avoidance. I threw myself into my caseload, spending extra hours with the teenagers I counseled at the Hartford Community Center. Kids like Marcus, whose parents had kicked him out for being gay, and Sophia, who was aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. Their problems put my family drama into perspective, yet somehow made the rejection sting more. Here I was, helping other people's children when my own family couldn't find room for me at Christmas. Daniel noticed my distraction immediately when he returned from his late evening at the office. He found me on our tiny couch, laptop balanced on my knees, responding to case emails at 9 p.m. "Rough day?" he asked, settling beside me and gently closing the laptop. "My mom called about Christmas," I said, then explained the entire conversation. Daniel's expression grew darker with each detail. "They want you to stay at a hotel during Christmas?" His voice carried the disbelief of someone raised in a family where belonging was never conditional. "It's not technically a hotel. It's a bed and breakfast. Very charming, according to my mother." Daniel wasn't amused by my attempt at humor. "Amanda, this is insane. You're their daughter. Christmas is supposed to be about family." "I am family. I'm just not the kind of family they want to showcase this year." We talked for hours that night, with Daniel encouraging me to stand up, for myself and me explaining the complex dynamics that made resistance feel futile. In the Rivers family, keeping peace meant accepting whatever role you were assigned, no matter how diminished. The following week brought another call, this time from Victoria herself. Her voice carried the crisp confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way, whether in corporate boardrooms or family situations. "Amanda, Mom told me about the Christmas arrangements. I think it's a brilliant solution." "Solution to what problem?" I asked, though I immediately regretted engaging. "Oh, you know how crowded things get. And honestly, with Jonathan's parents visiting from Boston and the Hendersons coming for Christmas Eve cocktails, it just makes sense to streamline things. You understand." Victoria had always possessed the ability to make exclusion sound like inclusion, to frame rejection as consideration. For my own comfort, it was a skill that served her well in her legal career, and apparently in family manipulation as well. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," I said carefully. "Well, of course you'll agree. It's what's best for everyone. And really, Amanda, it's not like you're much for the social aspects anyway. You always seem uncomfortable at Mom and Dad's parties." The observation wasn't wrong, but the casual way she dismissed my discomfort revealed how little my family understood or cared about my feelings. I was uncomfortable at their parties because I was made to feel like an outsider, judged for my career choice, my modest lifestyle, my boyfriend's less prestigious background. "Speaking of the social aspects," Victoria continued, "Mom wanted me to mention that the dress code for Christmas Eve is cocktail attire, something elegant. I know you don't usually." She paused delicately. "Prioritize that sort of thing, but it would mean a lot to the family if you made an effort this year." The message was clear. If I was going to be tolerated at their celebration, I needed to look the part. My usual simple dress and cardigan wouldn't meet the Rivers family standard for their holiday showcase. After Victoria hung up, I found myself standing in front of my closet, evaluating my limited formal wear options. The black dress I'd worn to my college graduation, the navy suit I'd bought for job interviews. Nothing that would meet Victoria's definition of elegant or my mother's standards for appropriate holiday attire. That evening, Daniel found me researching dress prices online, my laptop screen filled with cocktail dresses that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "You're not seriously considering buying an expensive dress just to appease them," he said, reading over my shoulder. "I don't know what else to do. If I show up looking inappropriate, they'll spend the entire evening making subtle comments about my appearance. If I don't show up at all, I'm the ungrateful daughter who ruined Christmas." Daniel sat beside me, his expression thoughtful. "What did your grandfather think about all this family hierarchy stuff?" The question caught me off guard. Grandpa, Harold had died 6 months earlier, and his absence still felt raw. He'd been the one person in my family who'd never made me feel inadequate, who'd celebrated my career choice and encouraged my relationship with Daniel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Grandpa always said that worth wasn't measured by bank accounts or job titles," I said softly. "He used to tell me that helping people was the highest calling, regardless of what society paid you for it." "Sounds like a wise man. What do you think he'd say about this Christmas situation?" I considered the question seriously. Grandpa Harold had built his wealth through hard work and smart investments, but he'd never used money as a weapon or status as a shield. He'd treated everyone with equal dignity, from his housekeeper Maria to the country club president. He'd probably tell me to stand up for myself, but he'd also understand why that's easier said than done. The memory of my grandfather sparked, something that had been dormant since his death, a sense of my own worth that existed independent of my family's approval. Harold Rivers had seen value in my work, pride in my independence, and potential in my future. His opinion had always mattered, more than anyone else's. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking more about Grandpa Harold and less about cocktail dresses and sleeping arrangements. I remembered our long conversations during his final months, when he talked about legacy and what really mattered in life. He'd been proud of the work I did, proud of my relationship with Daniel, proud of the woman I'd become, despite growing up in a family that prized appearance over substance. Those memories gave me the courage to make a decision that surprised even myself. I called my mother back and declined the bed and breakfast arrangement. "I've thought about it, and I'll be staying home for Christmas like always," I told Catherine, my voice steadier than I felt. "If space is really an issue, I'm sure we can figure something out." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched uncomfortably before my mother responded, her tone noticeably cooler. "I see. Well, I suppose we'll have to make do. Though I do hope you understand that with all our guests, things might be a bit complicated." "I'm sure we'll manage," I replied, though I was already beginning to understand that my small act of defiance had shifted something fundamental in the family dynamic. The remaining weeks leading up to Christmas passed with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite identify. Phone calls from home became briefer and less frequent. Victoria's texts about holiday plans grew more curt. Even my father, usually neutral in family conflicts, seemed distant during our weekly check-in calls. Daniel watched me navigate this increasing isolation with growing concern. His own family had already extended multiple invitations for me to join their Christmas celebration in Springfield, offering the kind of unconditional welcome that felt foreign after years in the Rivers family system. "You know you don't have to prove anything to them," he said one evening as we decorated our small apartment's Christmas tree with ornaments we'd collected together over 2 years of shared holidays. "It's not about proving anything. It's about belonging somewhere. You belong with people who value you for who you are, not who they think you should be." His words resonated with something Grandpa Harold used to say about choosing your own family from among the people who truly cared about your well-being. As I hung a small wooden ornament Harold had carved for me years ago, I felt his presence in a way that had been absent since his death. That ornament, simple and handmade, represented more love and acceptance than all of my family's elaborate holiday productions combined. It reminded me that I'd already experienced real family connection. I just hadn't recognized it as separate from the performance my parents had always demanded. 3 days before Christmas, I packed my bag for Millbrook, with a mixture of dread and determination. Despite their obvious preference that I stay away, I was going home for Christmas. Not to prove I belonged, but to honor the relationship I'd had with the one person in that house who'd truly loved me unconditionally. I had no idea that my decision to claim my place in the family would set in motion events that would reveal truths none of us were prepared to face. Sometimes the most ordinary acts of courage create extraordinary consequences, reshaping not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. As Daniel helped me load my bag into our old Honda, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window. I looked determined in a way I hadn't felt in months, as if Grandpa Harold's spirit had somehow strengthened my resolve. "Ready?" Daniel asked, squeezing my hand. "Ready," I replied, though I had no idea what I was ready for. The drive to Millbrook took us through Connecticut's winter landscape, past snow-covered fields and historic towns decorated for the holidays. As we approached my childhood home, that familiar knot returned to my stomach, but it was accompanied by something new. A quiet certainty that whatever happened over the next few days, I would face it as the person Harold Rivers had raised me to be, not the diminished version my parents seemed to prefer. The large colonial house stood exactly as I remembered, its windows glowing warmly against the early winter evening. Cars already filled the circular driveway, Victoria's black Mercedes, my parents' matching BMWs, and vehicles I didn't recognize, that must belong to the various guests who had apparently taken priority over my comfort. As we pulled up to the house that had never quite felt like home, I realized that this Christmas would be different. Not because my family had changed, but because I finally had. The front door opened before we could ring the bell, revealing my mother in a burgundy silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Catherine Rivers had perfected the art of looking effortlessly elegant, though I knew the effort involved countless hours of personal shopping, salon appointments, and careful coordination with whatever image she wanted to project that season. "Amanda, darling," she said, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. "You made it safely. How was the drive?" "Fine, thanks," I replied, stepping into the marble foyer that had always made me feel like I was entering a museum rather than a home. The house smelled of expensive candles and fresh flowers, probably arranged by the same florist who'd been handling my mother's entertaining needs for the past decade. Daniel followed behind me, carrying both our bags despite my mother's obvious focus on me alone. After 2 years of dating, Catherine still treated my boyfriend like a polite stranger, someone to be acknowledged, but not truly welcomed into the family circle. "Daniel," she added almost as an afterthought, "lovely to see you again. I hope you don't mind, but we've had to make some adjustments to the sleeping arrangements." Here it comes, I thought, bracing myself for whatever new indignity awaited us. Victoria and Jonathan are in the main guest suite, as planned, and Michael's girlfriend Sarah needed the blue guest room because of her allergies. Something about the detergent we use in the basement linens. Catherine's explanation came out rehearsed, as if she'd practiced delivering this news in the most reasonable tone possible. "So, where exactly are we staying?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "The finished basement has that lovely pull-out sofa, and there's a small bathroom down there. It's quite cozy, really. More privacy for you both." The basement. Not even the basement guest room this time, but the main basement area where my father stored his exercise equipment and my mother kept seasonal decorations. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd hung a sign declaring my status in the family hierarchy. Daniel's jaw tightened beside me, and I could feel his controlled anger on my behalf. But before either of us could respond, Victoria appeared at the top of the staircase, descending with the kind of practiced grace that came from years of finishing school and cotillion classes. "Amanda, you look." She paused, her gaze sweeping over my practical winter coat and comfortable jeans. Exactly the same as always. My sister had always possessed the ability to deliver insults disguised as observations, a skill that served her well in both her legal career and family interactions. Tonight she wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that complemented her highlighted hair perfectly, every detail of her appearance carefully calculated to project success and sophistication. "Victoria," I replied evenly, refusing to rise to the key bait. "Congratulations on the partnership. Mom mentioned it during our call." "Thank you. It's been quite the year. Jonathan and I were just telling the Hendersons about the new house. You should see it before you leave. Though I suppose your schedule doesn't allow for much social visiting." The dig at my work schedule was typical Victoria, implying that my dedication to my clients was somehow a character flaw rather than professional commitment. She'd never understood why I chose to work with troubled teenagers when I could have pursued something more prestigious, more financially rewarding. "My work keeps me busy," I acknowledged, "but it's fulfilling in ways that matter to me." "Of course it is, dear," my mother interjected quickly, clearly sensing the potential for conflict. "Why don't you get settled and then join us in the living room? We're having cocktails before dinner." As Daniel and I made our way down to the basement, I could hear the murmur of voices from the main floor, the kind of animated conversation that accompanied my family's social gatherings. The basement felt cold and unwelcoming, a stark contrast to the warmth and light upstairs where the real family members were entertaining their important guests. "This is unbelievable," Daniel muttered as he surveyed the pull-out sofa that would serve as our bed for the next 3 nights. "They're treating you like hired help, not family." "It's just sleeping arrangements," I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. "We won't be down here much anyway." Daniel turned to face me, his dark eyes serious. "Amanda, you need to hear yourself right now. You're making excuses for people who are deliberately humiliating you. This isn't about space constraints or guest allergies. This is about putting you in your place." His words stung because they were true. I'd spent so many years adapting to my family's subtle rejections that I'd developed an almost automatic response of minimizing their impact, of finding reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior. "What choice do I have?" I asked, sinking onto the uncomfortable sofa. "If I make a scene, I'm the difficult daughter who ruined Christmas. If I leave, I'm the ungrateful one who couldn't appreciate the family's hospitality. You have the choice to expect better treatment from people who claim to love you." Before I could respond, footsteps echoed on the basement stairs. Victoria appeared, now holding a glass of white wine and wearing an expression of concerned sisterly duty. "I wanted to check on you both," she said, though her tone suggested this was more obligation than genuine interest. "I know the accommodations aren't ideal, but I hope you understand that with Jonathan's parents driving up from Boston tomorrow morning, we needed to reserve the proper guest rooms for family." The casual cruelty of that statement, referring to her in-laws as family while relegating me to basement status, was so perfectly Victoria that I almost admired its efficiency. "Jonathan's parents are lovely people," she continued, apparently unaware of the impact of her words. "His father is a cardiovascular surgeon, and his mother sits on the board of the Boston Symphony. They're exactly the kind of connections Dad needs for expanding the firm's client base in Massachusetts." And there it was, the real explanation for the sleeping arrangements. Jonathan's parents represented valuable business opportunities, while Daniel and I offered nothing that would advance the Rivers family's social or financial standing. "I'm sure they're wonderful," I managed, though my voice probably betrayed more sarcasm than I intended. Victoria either missed the tone or chose to ignore it. "They are, and they're so accomplished. Mrs. Pierce was just telling me about their summer house on Martha's Vineyard. Apparently, they've been going to the same spot for 30 years. That kind of family tradition is so important, don't you think?" The implication was obvious. Real families, successful families, had traditions worth maintaining. Our family's tradition of excluding me from meaningful participation was apparently different, more justified somehow. "Speaking of traditions," Victoria continued, settling into the basement's single armchair as if preparing for a longer conversation, "Mom asked me to talk to you about Christmas Eve dinner tomorrow." I braced myself for whatever new restriction or expectation was about to be imposed. "The Hendersons are joining us, along with the Pierces, and Dad's partner Mr. Blackwood and his wife. It's quite an important evening for the family business, actually. Several potential deals in the works, and first impressions matter tremendously in our line of work." "I understand," I said, though I was beginning to understand far more than Victoria probably intended. "I knew you would. Now, about attire. Mom mentioned that you might need some guidance about appropriate dress for the evening. I brought you something." She gestured toward a garment bag I hadn't noticed her carrying. "It's a dress I wore to a firm party last year. Should fit you reasonably well, and it's certainly appropriate for the occasion." The offer of borrowed clothing felt like the final insult, a clear statement that my own wardrobe was inadequate for family functions. But as I looked at Victoria's expectant expression, I realized this wasn't meant as an insult at all. In her mind, she was being helpful, solving a problem that needed addressing. "That's very thoughtful," I said carefully. "But I brought something to wear." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? Well, of course, if you're certain. I just thought, given your usual style, that you might appreciate having something a bit more polished for such an important evening." Daniel had remained silent during this exchange, but I could feel his tension radiating from across the small space. When Victoria finally excused herself to return to the cocktail gathering upstairs, he waited until her footsteps faded before speaking. "Please tell me you're not going to wear her cast-off dress." "Of course not," I replied, though part of me wondered if my own choice would prove adequate for whatever performance my family expected tomorrow evening. The rest of that first evening passed in a blur of stilted conversation and careful navigation of family dynamics. During dinner, I found myself seated at the far end of the table next to Michael's girlfriend Sarah, who seemed as overwhelmed by the Rivers family formality as I felt excluded by it. Sarah was a kindergarten teacher from Boston, with an easy laugh and genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to my family's polished but superficial interactions. As the evening progressed, I realized that she and I were serving similar functions. Outsiders brought in to fill seats but not truly integrated into the family circle. "Your family is very elegant," Sarah whispered to me during one of my mother's lengthy descriptions of the Charity Auction Committee's recent fundraising success. "That's one word for it," I replied quietly, earning a knowing smile from someone who clearly recognized the performance aspect of our gathering. After dinner, the family dispersed into their usual post-meal activities. My parents retreated to the study with their coffee to discuss business matters with the Hendersons. Victoria and Jonathan settled in the living room to plan their activities for the following day. Michael took Sarah on a tour of the house, pointing out family photographs and antiques with the pride of someone who'd always felt securely positioned within the family narrative. Daniel and I found ourselves effectively dismissed from these intimate gatherings, not explicitly excluded, but certainly not included. We retreated to the basement earlier than we might have preferred, both of us exhausted by the constant vigilance required to navigate conversations where every topic seemed laden with subtle judgments about our lifestyle choices. How do you stand it? Daniel asked as we prepared for bed on the uncomfortable pull-out sofa. Practice, I replied, though the word came out more bitter than I'd intended. 28 years of practice. The next morning brought new challenges disguised as holiday traditions. I woke to find that breakfast had been served and cleared. While we were still sleeping, the family having apparently decided that 7 a.m. was a reasonable time for a meal despite our late evening. "Oh, you missed breakfast?" my mother said when I appeared in the kitchen, still in my pajamas and searching for coffee. "I didn't want to wake you. I thought you might need the extra rest." The consideration felt false, especially when I discovered that everyone else had been up for hours, planning activities and making arrangements that somehow didn't include me or Daniel. Victoria and Jonathan were taking the Pierces on a tour of Millbrook's historic district. Michael and Sarah were visiting the local Christmas market. My parents were hosting a pre-dinner cocktail party for their business associates. "What time should we be ready for the cocktail party?" I asked, assuming that as family members we'd naturally be included. My mother's hesitation lasted just long enough to communicate volumes. "Well, darling, it's really more of a business function. Quite boring, actually. Lots of talk about market conditions and investment strategies. I thought you and Daniel might prefer to explore the town on your own. There's a lovely little cafe downtown that serves excellent coffee." The dismissal was so smoothly delivered that it almost sounded like consideration for our comfort rather than exclusion from family activities. Almost, but not quite. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with my directness, "we'd like to join the cocktail party. Daniel's interested in learning more about the investment business." This was completely untrue. Daniel found my father's work ethically questionable at best, but I was tired of being managed and dismissed like an inconvenient obligation. My mother's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Of course, if you're certain. Just remember that it's quite a sophisticated crowd. First impressions matter tremendously in business." The warning was clear. Don't embarrass the family in front of important people. Don't let your lack of polish reflect poorly on the river's name. Don't forget that you're here on sufferance, not by right. The hours leading up to the evening's festivities passed in a haze of preparation and anxiety. I spent longer than usual, getting ready, choosing my outfit carefully and applying makeup with more attention than I typically bothered with. Not because I cared about impressing my parents' business associates, but because I was tired of being treated as an embarrassment to the family name. Daniel watched these preparations with growing concern, recognizing the signs of someone armoring themselves for battle. "You know you don't have to prove anything to these people," he reminded me as I stood before the bathroom mirror, applying lipstick with unusual precision. "Maybe not," I replied, "but I'm tired of being written off before I even speak." The cocktail party began promptly at 6, with guests arriving in expensive cars and designer clothing that spoke of success and social positioning. I recognized some faces from previous family gatherings, country club members, business associates, and social acquaintances who formed the core of my parents' carefully cultivated network. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing Jonathan to important contacts and discussing their recent achievements with the kind of casual pride that comes from never doubting your place in the social hierarchy. She looked beautiful and confident, every inch the successful daughter my parents could display with satisfaction. I, meanwhile, felt like an anthropologist studying an alien culture, observing rituals and customs that remained fundamentally foreign despite my lifelong exposure to them. The conversations followed predictable patterns: discussions of recent vacations to exclusive destinations, mentions of children's achievements at prestigious schools, subtle comparisons of material possessions and social connections. Amanda, my father, appeared at my side, his voice carrying that careful politeness he used when he needed me to behave appropriately in public. "I'd like you to meet Thomas Blackwood, my business partner, and his wife Jennifer." The Blackwoods were exactly what I'd expected: impeccably dressed, perfectly polite, and utterly uninterested in anything I might have to say once they learned about my career. Their eyes glazed over visibly when I mentioned working with at-risk teenagers, and they quickly redirected the conversation toward Victoria's legal achievements. "Your sister is quite impressive," Thomas Blackwood told me, as if I might not have noticed. "Sharp mind for a complex financial law. Robert's lucky to have such talent staying in the family business." The comment stung because it highlighted everything I wasn't: not staying in the family business, not contributing to the Rivers' legacy, not worthy of the kind of pride they felt discussing Victoria's accomplishments. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated from the conversation swirling around me. Daniel tried to engage with various guests, but his background in graphic design and nonprofit work made him equally foreign to this crowd of investment professionals and social climbers. It was during one particularly awkward conversation about private school options that I noticed something that stopped me cold. Mrs. Pierce, Jonathan's mother from Boston, was wearing a diamond bracelet that looked remarkably familiar. Not identical to one I'd seen before, but actually the same piece I remembered from my grandmother's jewelry collection. My grandmother had died when I was 12, and her jewelry had supposedly been distributed among family members according to her wishes. I'd never received anything, being told that most pieces had gone to my mother and Victoria, with a few special items being saved for when Victoria had daughters of her own. But this bracelet, with its distinctive Art Deco setting and unusual sapphire accents, had definitely belonged to my grandmother. I remembered her wearing it to church every Sunday, remembered asking her about the pretty blue stones when I was very young. "Excuse me," I said to Mrs. Pierce during a lull in conversation, my heart pounding with sudden adrenaline. "That's a beautiful bracelet. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Mrs. Pierce smiled with genuine pleasure, extending her wrist to show off the piece more clearly. "Thank you. It was a gift from Catherine, actually. She said it belonged to her mother and that she wanted it to go to someone who would truly appreciate its vintage beauty." The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed this information. My mother had given away my grandmother's jewelry to virtual strangers, people who were important for business reasons but had no connection to our family history. How thoughtful of my mother, I managed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Oh yes, Catherine has been so generous. This bracelet and a lovely pearl necklace she gave me last Christmas. She said they were family pieces that weren't being properly appreciated." Family pieces that weren't being properly appreciated. The implication was clear. These valuable items were better off with people who moved in the right social circles, who would display them at appropriate events, who understood their worth in ways that apparently I never could. I excused myself from the conversation and made my way to the powder room, needing space to process what I'd just learned. In the small, elegantly decorated bathroom, I stared at my reflection and tried to understand why this particular betrayal felt so devastating. It wasn't really about the jewelry itself, though the sentimental value was significant. It was about the complete erasure of my connection to family history, the casual dismissal of my right to inherit anything meaningful from the grandmother who'd loved me unconditionally. When I returned to the party, I found Daniel engaged in conversation with Sarah and Michael, the three of them clearly more comfortable with each other than with most of the other guests. Their discussion of teaching methods and creative projects felt like stepping into a warm room after hours in the cold. "There you are." Victoria appeared beside our small group, her timing impeccable as always. "The Pierces were just asking about you. They're so interested in hearing about your work with disadvantaged youth." The way she said disadvantaged youth made it sound like a curious hobby rather than a professional calling, but I was beyond caring about Victoria's subtle condescension. My mind was still reeling from the jewelry revelation, and I was struggling to maintain appropriate social behavior. "I'd be happy to talk with them," I said, though talking was the last thing I wanted to do. "Wonderful, though perhaps we should discuss appropriate ways to present your work. You know how important it is to frame these things properly for this kind of audience." And there it was again. The assumption that I couldn't be trusted to represent myself appropriately, that my natural way of speaking about my work would somehow embarrass the family or reflect poorly on their reputation. I think I can manage. To discuss my own career without coaching? I replied, my patience finally beginning to fray. Victoria's perfectly applied smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course you can, dear. I just thought you might appreciate some guidance about emphasizing the positive aspects rather than dwelling on the more challenging elements of your work. The suggestion that I regularly dwelt on negative aspects of working with troubled teenagers revealed how little my sister understood about either my work or my character. But before I could respond, my mother appeared with the kind of timing that suggested she'd been monitoring our conversation. "Girls?" she said with forced brightness. "The Hendersons are leaving soon, and they wanted to say goodbye. Victoria, they mentioned being very interested in that property development project you and Jonathan are considering." Victoria immediately shifted into professional mode, following our mother toward the departing guests and leaving me standing with Daniel, Michael, and Sarah in a small bubble of relative authenticity within the larger performance. "Family dynamics are complicated," Sarah observed quietly, clearly having witnessed enough of our interaction to understand the undercurrents. "That's one way to put it," I replied, grateful for her diplomatic understatement. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, I found myself helping clear glasses and straighten furniture with automatic efficiency. It was easier to stay busy than to think too deeply about everything I'd observed and experienced during the cocktail party. "You don't need to do that, dear," my mother said, taking a crystal glass from my hands. "Maria will handle the cleanup in the morning." Even this small act of helpfulness was apparently inappropriate, another reminder that I didn't quite fit the expected role of honored daughter at a family gathering. Later that night, lying on the uncomfortable pull-out sofa, next to Daniel, I finally allowed myself to think about the full scope of what was happening. The sleeping arrangements, the exclusion from family activities, the jewelry given away to strangers, the constant subtle corrections and suggestions for improvement. This wasn't just about Christmas traditions or space constraints. This was about my family systematically communicating that I didn't belong, that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, that my value as a daughter was conditional on my willingness to accept whatever diminished role they assigned me. "Are you okay?" Daniel whispered in the darkness. "No," I replied honestly. "I don't think I am." Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, the culmination of all these careful preparations and social positioning. Tomorrow I would face the formal dinner where my family would showcase their success and connections, while I sat at whatever distant corner of the table they deemed appropriate for someone of my reduced status. But tonight, lying in the basement of my childhood home while the people who claimed to love me slept comfortably upstairs, I finally began to understand that no amount of accommodation or self-improvement would ever earn me genuine acceptance from people who had fundamentally written me off. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt strangely liberating, as if a burden I'd been carrying for years was finally beginning to lift. Christmas Eve morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the basement feel like a refrigerator. I woke to the sound of footsteps overhead and muffled voices discussing plans for the day's activities. Daniel was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who'd spent the night processing uncomfortable truths. "Sleep well?" I asked, though his restless tossing had already answered that question. "About as well as you'd expect on a torture device masquerading as furniture," he replied, stretching his back with obvious discomfort. But that's not what kept me awake. Before I could ask what he meant, the basement door opened and my mother's voice drifted down the stairs. "Amanda, are you awake, dear? We need to discuss today's schedule." I grabbed a robe and climbed the stairs to find Catherine already. Dressed in expensive casual wear, her hair and makeup perfect despite the early hour, she stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a detailed timeline written in her precise handwriting. "Good morning, Mom. What's the schedule?" Well, it's going to be quite a busy day. The Pierces will be arriving around 10 for brunch. Then we have the Christmas Eve service at 11:30, followed by lunch at the country club. This evening is the formal dinner, of course, with cocktails beginning at 6. I listened to this packed agenda and wondered where exactly Daniel and I fit into any of these carefully orchestrated activities. The Christmas Eve service? I asked. At St. Matthew's? My mother's slight hesitation told me everything I needed to know before she answered. Actually, we'll be attending services at Trinity Episcopal downtown. The Pierces are longtime members there, and Reverend Phillips is expecting us to join them. It's quite an honor, really. Trinity has such a distinguished congregation. Trinity Episcopal was where Millbrook's most prominent families attended services, a social institution as much as a religious one. The implication was clear. My family's regular church wasn't prestigious enough for their Christmas Eve celebration with the important guests. What about our pew at St. Matthew's? We've attended Christmas Eve service there my entire life. Oh, traditions can be flexible when circumstances call for it. Besides, this gives us an opportunity to strengthen our relationship with the Pierce family. Jonathan's father knows several potential clients who attend Trinity. Everything came back to business connections, to social positioning, to advancing the Rivers family's standing in increasingly elite circles. My childhood church, where Grandpa Harold had served as a deacon for 30 years, was apparently dispensable when more advantageous alternatives presented themselves. I think Daniel and I will stick with St. Matthew's, I said, surprising myself, with the firmness in my voice. My mother's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. I'm sorry? We'll attend the 11 o'clock service at St. Matthew's like always. We can meet back here afterward for whatever other activities you have planned. Catherine's expression shifted into what I recognized as her crisis management mode, the look she wore when unexpected complications threatened her carefully arranged plans. Amanda, I don't think you understand. This is a family occasion. We're expected to attend as a family unit. The Pierces are our guests, and it would be terribly rude to abandon them for our own preferences. They're not abandoning anyone. They're attending a different service with their son-in-law's family. We're attending the service at our family's church. Everyone's spiritual needs are met. The logic was unassailable, but logic wasn't really the issue. This was about my willingness to prioritize family obligation over personal preference, about demonstrating that I understood my role in the Rivers family hierarchy. I really wish you'd reconsider, my mother said, her tone carrying a warning I'd learned to recognize over the years. This kind of independence creates unnecessary complications. For who? The question hung in the air between us while Catherine clearly struggled to articulate why my church attendance was anyone's concern besides my own. Finally, she fell back on the standard family negotiation tactic. Your father will be very disappointed. You know how important family unity is to him, especially during the holidays. Robert Rivers' disappointment had been used as a weapon throughout my childhood, the ultimate guilt trip deployed whenever I showed signs of thinking for myself. But this morning, perhaps because I was finally understanding the full scope of my exclusion from authentic family connection, the threat felt less powerful than usual. I'm sure Dad will understand that Daniel and I want to attend our own church on Christmas Eve. Before my mother could respond, Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day in clothes that managed to look both casual and expensive. Her timing was too perfect to be coincidental. She'd clearly been listening to our conversation. "What's this about church?" she asked with the bright tone of someone eager to help resolve a silly misunderstanding. Catherine explained the situation while Victoria listened with expressions of increasing concern, as if my preference for St. Matthew's represented some kind of character flaw that needed addressing. "Oh, Amanda," Victoria said when our mother finished, "You can't be serious. Trinity is such a beautiful church, and their Christmas Eve service is legendary. People wait years to get invitations to attend with member families. I'm sure it's lovely, but I'd prefer to attend the church where Grandpa Harold served as deacon for 3 decades. The mention of our grandfather created a momentary silence. Harold Rivers had been universally respected in Millbrook, known for his integrity and his commitment to community service. Invoking his memory in support of my position was strategically effective, but it also felt genuinely important. Grandpa would have understood the importance of family obligations, Victoria replied carefully. He always put family first. He put principles first, I corrected. Family was important to him, but not at the expense of his values or beliefs. This theological discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Jonathan, who appeared in the die-eye kitchen looking for coffee and walked directly into the middle of our family disagreement. "Good morning, everyone," he said with the careful cheer of someone sensing tension but unsure of its source. "Lovely day for Christmas Eve." "Amanda has decided she doesn't want to attend church with the family," Victoria explained, framing my position in the most unreasonable terms possible. Jonathan looked confused, which was reasonable given Victoria's deliberately misleading summary. "Oh, is there a problem with the service time or something?" "No problem," I said before anyone else could speak for me. "Daniel and I are planning to attend our regular church for Christmas Eve service. Everyone else is going to Trinity Episcopal with your parents." "That makes sense," Jonathan replied with the easy acceptance of someone who hadn't yet learned that everything in the Rivers family carried hidden significance. "Different churches, same celebration. My parents will love Trinity's service." His reasonable response clearly frustrated both my mother and Victoria, who had expected him to support their position that my church preference was somehow problematic. "Yes, well," Catherine said with forced brightness, "we'll sort out the details later. Right now I need to start preparing for brunch. The Pierces will be here in 2 hours." This effectively ended the church discussion, but I could tell from Victoria's expression that the matter was far from resolved in her mind. She followed me toward the basement door, catching my arm gently but firmly. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" We stepped into the empty dining room, where Victoria immediately launched into what I recognized as her lawyer voice, the tone she used when trying to convince judges or juries of her position. "Amanda, I need you to understand what's really happening here. Dad's been working on a major deal with the Pierce family's investment group. We're talking about a potential $50 million partnership that could transform the firm's entire future." The number was larger than I'd expected, but the underlying dynamic was familiar. Business considerations trumped personal preferences, as always. "Jonathan's father has been evaluating Dad's firm for 6 months, Victoria continued. "This weekend is essentially a final assessment of our family's reliability and social standing. Everything needs to go perfectly." "And my attending a different church threatens that, how exactly?" Victoria's frustration showed briefly before she regained her professional composure. "It's not about the church specifically. It's about demonstrating family cohesion, about showing that we can present a united front when it matters. Successful business families don't have members going off on their own during important social occasions." The phrase "going off on my own" made my desire to attend my grandfather's church sound like teenage rebellion rather than a reasonable adult choice. But I was beginning to understand that in Victoria's worldview, any action that prioritized my preferences over family image was inherently selfish. What if I promised to be charming and appropriate at every other event this weekend? Would that satisfy the family cohesion requirement? This isn't a negotiation, Amanda. This is about understanding that sometimes individual preferences need to be set aside for the greater good of the family. Whose greater good? Dad's business deal? Your relationship with your in-laws? Or the actual well-being of family members? Victoria's expression hardened in a way I'd seen during her most challenging legal cases, when opposing counsel had pushed her into a corner and she needed to reassert control. "I'm trying to help you understand the situation so you can make a smart decision. But if you're determined to be difficult, that's your choice. Just remember that actions have consequences, especially when they affect other people's lives and livelihoods. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. My behavior this weekend could have lasting implications for my relationships with family members, my welcome at future gatherings, my position in whatever inheritance considerations might eventually arise. After Victoria left me alone in the dining room, I stood among the formal furniture and expensive artwork, feeling like a stranger in the house where I'd grown up. Every item in this room represented my family's successful climb up Millbrook's social ladder, but none of it reflected any part of who I actually was or what I valued. The Pierce family arrived precisely at 10, emerging from their luxury sedan like visiting dignitaries. Dr. Pierce was distinguished in the way that successful older men often are, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect and deference. Mrs. Pierce wore the kind of understated but expensive outfit that spoke of generational wealth and impeccable taste. I watched through the living room window as my parents greeted their guests with the careful choreography of people trying to make an excellent impression. Victoria and Jonathan appeared immediately, completing the picture of a successful, well-connected family, ready to welcome equally successful peers. Daniel joined me at the window, observing the scene with the anthropologist's eye he'd developed over 2 years of Rivers family gatherings. "They look nervous," he observed. $50 million nervous, I replied, then explained what Victoria had told me about the business deal at stake. Daniel whistled softly. "That explains the military precision of this weekend's planning, and the extra pressure on you to conform. The question is whether I care enough about their business deal to sacrifice my own preferences. What would your grandfather say about that?" The question stopped me short because I knew exactly what Harold Rivers would have said. He'd built his wealth through honest business practices and smart investments, but he'd never compromised his principles for financial gain. He'd served on the boards of several charitable organizations, attended the same modest church for decades, and treated everyone with equal dignity regardless of their social status or bank account. Grandpa Harold had also loved me unconditionally, something that was becoming more precious in my memory as I experienced the conditional nature of my parents' acceptance. "He'd say that integrity isn't negotiable," I answered, "that people who require you to abandon your values to earn their approval aren't worth having in your life." "Even if they're family?" "Especially if they're family. He used to tell me, that family should be where you feel most free to be yourself, not where you have to perform the hardest." Brunch with the Pierces proceeded exactly as I'd expected, with conversation carefully steered toward topics that showcased the Rivers family's success and sophistication. My parents discussed recent vacation destinations, Victoria detailed her latest legal victories, and everyone avoided mentioning my career or any other subject that might remind the guests that not all family members moved in elite circles. I participated minimally, responding politely when directly addressed, but otherwise allowing the conversation to flow around me. Daniel made more effort to engage, asking thoughtful questions about Dr. Pierce's medical practice and Mrs. Pierce's volunteer work with the Boston Symphony. It was during a discussion of summer travel plans that Mrs. Pierce mentioned the Martha's Vineyard house Victoria had referenced the night before. "We've been going to the same spot for 35 years, she said with the satisfaction of someone whose life was organized around reliable pleasures. "Same cottage, same beach, same little restaurant for dinner every Friday night. Jonathan's been coming with us since he was a child. How wonderful to have that kind of family tradition," my mother replied with genuine wistfulness. "We've always meant to establish something similar, but Robert's work schedule makes long-term planning so challenging." This was completely untrue. My parents had the resources and flexibility to create any traditions they wanted. They simply preferred the novelty of different destinations each year, the status that came from being well-traveled rather than attached to any particular place. "Perhaps you could join us sometime," Mrs. Pierce offered graciously. "We always rent the large cottage, and there's plenty of room for extended family visits." The invitation was clearly meant to include Victoria and Jonathan, not the broader Rivers clan, but my mother accepted it as if it applied to everyone. That sounds absolutely delightful. We'd love to experience the vineyard through the eyes of longtime residents. I caught Daniel's eye across the table and saw my own thoughts reflected in his expression. My parents were already mentally rewriting family vacation traditions to align with the Pierce family's preferences, just as they'd abandoned our family church for a more prestigious alternative. After brunch, the great church debate resumed with renewed intensity. My father joined the conversation for the first time, adding his authoritative voice to the pressure campaign. "I understand you want to attend St. Matthew's," he said with the reasonable tone he used for business negotiations. "But I hope you'll reconsider for the sake of family unity this weekend." "Dad, it's just church. We'll be back in time for everything else." "It's not just church, Amanda. It's about demonstrating that this family can present a cohesive front when circumstances require it. The Pierces are evaluating everything about us, including how well we function as a unit." The frank admission that I was being evaluated alongside the family's other assets was more honest than usual, but also more insulting. I wasn't being asked to accommodate guests or show respect for traditions. I was being required to perform my role in a business presentation. "What if I don't want to be part of your business presentation?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse my father, as if I'd asked why I wouldn't want to help the family succeed financially. This partnership could secure the firm's future for the next generation. It could provide opportunities for Victoria and Jonathan that we never imagined possible. Why wouldn't you want to support that? Because it requires me to pretend to be someone I'm not. Because it treats our family's authentic traditions as expendable when they don't serve the right image. Because it reduces me to a prop in someone else's performance. Robert's expression shifted into what I recognized as his crisis management mode, the look he wore when business deals encountered unexpected complications. "You're being overly dramatic. We're asking you to attend one church service with family guests. It's a small accommodation that any reasonable person would make, any reasonable person who understood their place in the family hierarchy," I corrected. Any reasonable person who didn't expect their own preferences to matter when business interests were at stake. The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's return from showing the Pierces to their guest suite, but I could tell from my father's expression that our discussion was far from over. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation for the evening's formal dinner. I spent the afternoon helping with various tasks, setting the dining room table with my mother's best china and crystal, arranging flowers, and generally trying to be useful without getting in anyone's way. Daniel had disappeared somewhere with Michael and Sarah, probably exploring downtown Millbrook or finding refuge from the family tension in neutral territory. I envied their escape, but felt obligated to remain available for whatever last-minute needs might arise. It was during this domestic preparation that I overheard a conversation that changed everything. My mother and Victoria were in the kitchen discussing seating arrangements for dinner when they apparently forgot I was in the adjacent pantry organizing serving pieces. "I still think we should seat Amanda and Daniel at the far end of the table," Victoria was saying, "next to Michael and Sarah, away from the main conversation." "But that leaves 2 empty seats in the middle section," my mother replied. "It will look unbalanced." "Then we'll move the place cards around. Put Jonathan's parents closer to you and Dad. Seat Amanda where it's less obvious that she doesn't really fit with the rest of the group." Zai, the casual cruelty of that phrase, "doesn't really fit with the rest of the group," took my breath away. This wasn't about space constraints or social dynamics. This was about deliberately marginalizing me at what was supposed to be a family celebration. "What about her feelings?" my mother asked, though her tone suggested this was a minor consideration rather than a serious concern. "Amanda's feelings are less important than ensuring the Pierces have a comfortable evening. We can't risk having her dominate conversation with stories about troubled teenagers or social justice issues. This dinner needs to focus on positive, uplifting topics." You're probably right. We'll put her next to Sarah, and they can chat about teaching or whatever. That should keep her occupied and out of the main conversation. I stood frozen in the pantry, crystal serving bowls in my hands, absorbing the full impact of what I'd just heard. My own family was actively planning to exclude me from meaningful participation in our Christmas Eve dinner, treating me like a potential embarrassment who needed to be managed and contained. The serving bowls felt suddenly heavy in my hands, their weight somehow symbolic of the burden I'd been carrying for years without fully recognizing it. The burden of trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I wasn't worth including, who saw my presence as something to be minimized rather than celebrated. When I emerged from the pantry, both my mother and Victoria looked momentarily startled, clearly wondering how much I'd overheard. Their expressions confirmed that I'd heard exactly what they'd intended to keep private. "Amanda?" My mother began with forced brightness. "We were just finalizing the seating arrangements for tonight. We thought you'd be most comfortable next." To Sarah and Michael. "Most comfortable," I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Or most contained?" Victoria's lawyer instincts kicked in immediately, recognizing that a situation had developed that required careful management. "I'm not sure what you mean by that." "I mean that you're deliberately seating me away from the main conversation, because you're afraid I'll embarrass the family in front of your important guests." The silence that followed was deafening. Neither my mother nor Victoria bothered to deny the accusation, which was somehow more devastating than outright lies would have been. "Amanda," my mother finally said, "you have to understand that tonight is extremely important for your father's business. We need everything to go smoothly." "And my presence threatens that?" "Your perspective. I can sometimes be a bit intense for social situations," Victoria offered carefully. "We just thought you'd be more comfortable in a quieter part of the table." "Stop lying to me," I said, my voice gaining strength from some source I hadn't known existed. "Stop pretending this is about my comfort when it's really about your embarrassment. You think I'm not good enough to sit with your precious guests, so you're relegating me to the children's table like I'm 12 years old." "That's not fair," my mother protested, though her tone lacked conviction. "What's not fair is being treated like a second-class family member in my own childhood home. What's not fair is having my grandmother's jewelry given away to strangers while I get basement accommodations. What's not fair is being asked to abandon my church, my values, and my dignity to make your business deal more comfortable." The words poured out of me with increasing intensity, years of suppressed frustration finally finding expression. Victoria and my mother stood frozen, clearly unprepared for this level of directness from someone they'd trained to accept whatever treatment they offered. "You need to calm down," Victoria said in her professional mediation voice. "This is exactly the kind of emotional reaction that makes social situations difficult." "No," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd ever heard it. "I need to stop pretending that any of this is acceptable. I need to stop making excuses for people who've made it clear that I'm not welcome in my own family." "Of course you're welcome," my mother said quickly. "You're being overly sensitive about arrangements that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. They matter to me. And the fact that you think they shouldn't matter is exactly the problem." I walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to my parents' bedroom, needing space to think clearly about what I'd just learned and what I wanted to do about it. Behind me, I could hear Victoria and my mother discussing damage control, their voices carrying the urgent tone of people trying to solve an unexpected crisis. In my parents' room, I stood at the window overlooking the backyard where I'd played as a child, trying to reconcile my memories of belonging with the reality of my current exclusion. This house had once felt like home, but that feeling had been slowly eroded by years of subtle rejections and conditional acceptance. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Taking a walk downtown with Michael and Sarah. Back soon. How are things going?" I stared at his message, wondering how to explain that everything I'd thought I understood about my place in the family had just collapsed completely. How do you tell someone that you've been living in denial about relationships that matter? More to you than they apparently matter to anyone else. Before I could formulate a response, my father appeared in the bedroom doorway, his expression carrying the careful control he used for serious business conversations. Your mother says there's been some kind of misunderstanding about tonight's dinner arrangements. There's no misunderstanding. I overheard Victoria and Mom planning to marginalize me at my own family's Christmas Eve dinner because they're afraid I'll embarrass them in front of their business contacts. Robert closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying me with the analytical gaze he usually reserved for investment portfolios and market reports. Amanda, I need you to understand something about how business relationships work. First impressions matter enormously in our industry. The way we present ourselves, our family, our values, everything is being evaluated when we're being considered for partnerships of this magnitude. So, I'm a liability? You're different from what people in our circle typically expect. Your work, your lifestyle, your perspectives, they don't align with the image we need to project to succeed in this business. The frank admission was somehow more devastating than the subtle exclusions I'd been experiencing. My father was explicitly confirming that I was an embarrassment to the family, someone whose authentic self was incompatible with their ambitions. Then maybe I shouldn't be here at all, I said quietly. Don't be dramatic. We're asking for minor accommodations during an important weekend, not fundamental changes to your life. You're asking me to accept that I don't matter as much as your business deal. You're asking me to pretend that's reasonable. Robert's expression shifted into what I recognized as his final negotiation stance, the position he took when he was prepared to walk away from deals that couldn't be resolved on his terms. I'm asking you to consider whether your individual preferences are more important than your family's future prosperity. I'm asking you to demonstrate the kind of loyalty and sacrifice that successful families require from all their members. Even when that sacrifice includes abandoning my dignity? Dignity is a luxury that people in our position can't always afford. Sometimes we have to play roles we don't necessarily enjoy for the greater good of everyone involved. The conversation was interrupted by voices from downstairs. The return of Daniel, Michael, and Sarah from their afternoon exploration. Their laughter drifted up through the house, a sound of genuine connection that contrasted sharply with the tense negotiation taking place in my parents' bedroom. Think about what I've said, my father concluded, moving toward the door. Tonight's dinner is extremely important. I hope you'll find a way to support the family when it really matters. After he left, I remained standing at the window, watching the late afternoon light fade across the backyard. In a few hours, I would be expected to dress appropriately, smile pleasantly, and accept whatever diminished role my family had assigned me in their Christmas Eve performance. But something fundamental had shifted during these conversations. The illusion that I was a valued family member who occasionally faced minor social challenges had been completely shattered. I was now forced to confront the reality that my family saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The question was whether I had the courage to stop managing myself for their convenience and start honoring the person Grandpa Harold had raised me to be, even if that meant facing consequences I couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the first snow of Christmas Eve began to fall, coating the familiar landscape in pristine white that made everything look clean and new, full of possibility for transformation. Christmas Eve dinner began at precisely 6 o'clock, with the Pierce family descending the main staircase like royalty, making a grand entrance. Mrs. Pierce wore an elegant black dress that complemented the diamond bracelet I now knew had once belonged to my grandmother, while Dr. Pierce looked distinguished in his perfectly tailored suit. I had chosen my outfit carefully, settling on a dark green dress that was appropriate without being ostentatious, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings that I'd managed to keep when the rest of her jewelry disappeared into my mother's gift-giving strategies. The earrings felt like armor, a tangible connection to the one person in this family who had loved me unconditionally. Daniel looked handsome in his navy suit, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as we prepared to navigate another evening of careful social performance. We'd spent the late afternoon discussing whether to simply leave, whether to endure the dinner for appearance's sake, or whether to confront the family dynamics head-on. "You don't owe them anything," he'd reminded me as I'd struggled with my decision. "Not your compliance, not your silence, and definitely not your dignity." The dining room had been transformed into something worthy of a magazine photo shoot, with crystal candlesticks casting warm light over my mother's finest china and elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Place cards sat at each setting, and I noticed mine was indeed positioned at the far end of the table, next to Sarah and as far from the main conversation as possible. "Amanda, you look lovely," Mrs. Pierce said as we gathered for pre-dinner. Cocktails in the living room. "That shade of green is perfect for the holidays." "Thank you. You look beautiful as well. I particularly admire your bracelet." Mrs. Pierce's face lit up with genuine pleasure as she extended her wrist to show off the piece more clearly. "It's one of my favorites. Your mother gave it to me last Christmas, along with the most touching story about how it belonged to your grandmother and how she wanted it to find a new home where it would be cherished." The casual way she shared this information, completely unaware of its impact on me, felt like a physical blow. My mother had apparently created an entire narrative about wanting to honor my grandmother's memory by ensuring her jewelry went to deserving recipients, rather than admitting she was simply redistributing family heirlooms according to her current social priorities. "I'm sure Grandma would be pleased to know her jewelry is being appreciated," I managed, though my voice probably betrayed more emotion than I intended. "Oh yes, Catherine told me how close you were to your grandmother. She said you inherited her artistic sensibilities, but that the family jewelry was better suited to formal social occasions than your more casual lifestyle." The repeated insults delivered with such innocent kindness were almost worse than direct hostility. Mrs. Pierce genuinely believed she was sharing a heartwarming story about my mother's thoughtfulness, completely oblivious to the cruelty embedded in every word. Victoria appeared at my elbow with perfect timing, as if she'd been monitoring the conversation for potentially dangerous territory. "Mrs. Pierce, I wanted to ask you about the Boston Symphony Board. Jonathan mentioned you've been involved with their education outreach programs." The redirection worked smoothly, drawing Mrs. Pierce into a discussion of cultural philanthropy that allowed me to step away from the conversation before my composure cracked completely. I found refuge near the fireplace, where Daniel was engaged in what appeared to be a surprisingly animated discussion with Dr. Pierce about environmental sustainability in medical practices. "Your boyfriend is quite impressive," my father said, appearing beside me with his characteristic ability to materialize whenever family diplomacy required attention. "Dr. Pierce was just telling me how refreshing it is to meet a young person with genuine expertise in sustainable design." The compliment about Daniel was clearly meant to soften whatever criticism was coming next, a negotiation tactic I'd seen Robert use countless times in business situations. "He's knowledgeable about many things," I replied carefully. "Yes, well, knowledge and social presentation are two different skills. I hope you'll both remember that tonight's conversation needs to focus on positive, uplifting topics. Business discussions, cultural activities, travel experiences, the kind of subjects that make for pleasant dinner conversation." The warning was delivered with my father's usual diplomatic precision, but the message was unmistakable. Stay in your lane, don't bring up your work with troubled teenagers, and definitely don't say anything that might remind the Pierce family that the Rivers clan included someone who worked with societies less fortunate. "I understand perfectly," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "You want me to pretend to be someone I'm not for the sake of your business deal." Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I want you to be the best version of yourself, the version that supports family success rather than complicating it." Before I could respond to this latest iteration of the same impossible demand, my mother appeared to announce that dinner was ready. The group migrated toward the dining room with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested careful choreography rather than natural movement. The seating arrangement was exactly as I'd overheard, with the Pierce family positioned near my parents at the head of the table, Victoria and Jonathan in the middle section, and Daniel, Sarah, Michael, and myself relegated to what amounted to a separate conversation zone at the far end. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd hung a sign declaring our secondary status. Dinner conversation proceeded predictably for the first hour, with topics flowing smoothly between business, opportunities, cultural events, and travel experiences. My mother had clearly briefed everyone on appropriate subjects, and the discussion remained safely within bounds that showcased the Rivers family's sophistication and success. I participated minimally, responding when directly addressed, but otherwise allowing the performance to continue around me. Sarah seemed equally aware of our marginalized position, occasionally catching my eye with expressions of shared understanding about our outsider status. It was during the main course that Dr. Pierce made an observation that would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. "Robert, I have to say that your family's cohesion is impressive. So many successful families struggle with competing priorities and different life paths, but you've managed to maintain remarkable unity of purpose." My father beamed with satisfaction at this assessment, clearly viewing it as confirmation that the weekend's careful orchestration was achieving its intended effect. "Family unity has always been our highest priority," he replied. "We believe that individual success is meaningless unless it contributes to the collective strength of the family unit." "Exactly right," Mrs. Pierce agreed. "Too many young people today prioritize personal fulfillment over family obligation. It's refreshing to see a family where everyone understands their role in the larger picture." The conversation was veering into territory that made my stomach clench with growing unease. The Pierce family was praising my parents for achieving exactly the kind of forced conformity that had made my life miserable, holding up our supposed unity as an example other families should follow. "Of course, it helps that all your children have chosen paths that complement the family's overall trajectory," Dr. Pierce continued. "Victoria's legal career obviously supports the business, and I assume Amanda's work in education provides valuable community connections." The polite fiction that my social work represented strategic community engagement rather than a fundamental rejection of family values was so absurd that I almost laughed. But before I could decide how to respond, Victoria jumped in with damage control. "Amanda has always been our family's conscience," she said, with the kind of bright tone that suggested she was walking through a minefield. "Her work with disadvantaged youth reminds us all of our obligation to give back to the community." The description of my career as the family's charitable hobby was both condescending and fundamentally dishonest. But it served Victoria's purpose of making my choices sound like a deliberate family strategy rather than a personal rebellion against their values. "How wonderful," Mrs. Pierce said, turning toward me with renewed interest. "Community service is such an important part of maintaining social responsibility. I imagine your work provides excellent networking opportunities with other philanthropic families." The assumption that I'd chosen social work for networking purposes rather than genuine commitment to helping vulnerable teenagers was so tone-deaf that I felt something snap inside me. The careful control I'd maintained throughout the weekend finally cracked under the weight of accumulated insults and willful misunderstanding. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the dinner conversation, "I didn't choose social work for networking opportunities. I chose it because I believe society has an obligation to help its most vulnerable members, regardless of their ability to provide anything in return." The slight shift in Dr. Pierce's expression suggested he'd heard something unexpected, while my mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth in obvious alarm. "Of course," Mrs. Pierce said quickly. "That's exactly the kind of values-based approach that makes such work meaningful. I'm sure you've met many interesting families through your community involvement. Her determination to reframe my work, in terms of social connections rather than social justice, revealed how completely she misunderstood both my motivations and my actual job responsibilities. I work primarily with teenagers who've been abandoned by their families, I continued, ignoring the warning looks from my parents. Kids who've been kicked out for being gay, aging out of foster care with nowhere to go, struggling with addiction, while their families pretend they don't exist. Most of them come from backgrounds that wouldn't provide networking opportunities with anyone you'd want to meet at a country club. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked fascinated, Daniel proud, and everyone else varying degrees of uncomfortable or horrified. How challenging that must be, Dr. Pierce said carefully, clearly struggling to find an appropriate response to information that had no place in his worldview of appropriate dinner conversation. It's the most important work I've ever done, I replied. These kids have been written off by everyone who was supposed to protect them, and sometimes a social worker is the only person standing between them and complete despair. Victoria's legal training kicked in immediately, her damage control instincts working to redirect the conversation away from topics that might make their guests uncomfortable. Amanda's passion for her work is admirable, she said with forced brightness, though we sometimes worry that she takes on too much emotional responsibility for situations that are beyond any individual's ability to solve. The suggestion that my commitment to my clients represented poor emotional boundaries rather than professional dedication was Victoria's way of dismissing my work as psychological dysfunction rather than principled choice. Someone has to take responsibility, I replied, my voice gaining strength from somewhere I didn't recognize. Someone has to care about what happens to kids that society has decided aren't worth saving. Certainly, my father interjected with obvious desperation to move the conversation toward safer territory, but there are many ways to contribute to community welfare. Charitable fundraising, board service, volunteer coordination, approaches that bring together resources and expertise from across the community. His implication that direct service was somehow less valuable than the kind of philanthropic activities favored by wealthy families was exactly the attitude that had driven me toward social work in the first place. Grandpa Harold would have disagreed with that assessment, I said quietly. The mention of my grandfather created another moment of stillness around the table. Harold Rivers had been universally respected in Millbrook, known for his integrity, and his genuine commitment to helping others rather than simply appearing charitable. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, Dr. Pierce said with obvious sincerity. I had the privilege of serving on the hospital board with him for several years. His dedication to expanding services for underserved populations was truly inspiring. He believed that privilege created obligation, I continued, feeling Harold's presence somehow strengthening my resolve. Not the obligation to maintain appearances or protect social standing, but the obligation to use whatever advantages you've been given to help people who haven't been as fortunate. My mother's expression had shifted into full crisis management mode, but she was clearly struggling to find a way to shut down this line of conversation without creating an even bigger scene. Harold was indeed committed to charitable work, she said carefully, though he always understood the importance of working within established systems and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Appropriate boundaries, I repeated, my voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. Like the appropriate boundary that prevents me from sitting with the real family members at Christmas dinner? Like the appropriate boundary that makes my grandmother's jewelry more suitable for strangers than for her own granddaughter? Mrs. Pierce's hand moved instinctively to the bracelet, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning understanding. Jonathan looked between his parents and my family with obvious bewilderment, while Victoria's face had gone pale with the realization that I was about to reveal information she'd assumed would remain private. Amanda, my father said in the warning tone he'd used throughout my childhood when I was approaching the limits of acceptable behavior. No, I replied, standing up from my chair with sudden decisiveness. I'm done pretending that any of this is normal or acceptable. I'm done acting grateful for being treated like a second-class family member in my own childhood home. Daniel immediately pushed back his chair, clearly prepared to stand with me whatever came next. Sarah looked fascinated by this departure from social convention, while Michael appeared torn between family loyalty and obvious sympathy for my position. You've spent this entire weekend managing me like a potential embarrassment, I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the elegant dining room. Relegating me to basement accommodations, excluding me from family activities, planning to marginalize me at this dinner because you're afraid I might say something that doesn't align with your business interests. That's not what's happening. Here, Victoria protested, but her lawyer's instincts were clearly struggling against the weight of accumulated evidence. Then explain the seating chart. Explain why I was asked to stay at a hotel. Explain why my grandmother's jewelry has been given away to virtual strangers while I get basement sleeping arrangements. Mrs. Pierce's discomfort was now visible as she began to understand that her beautiful bracelet represented something more complicated than family generosity. I think there might be some misunderstanding about the jewelry, she said carefully. Catherine told me these pieces weren't being used by family members and that she wanted them to find homes where they'd be appreciated. They weren't being used because I was never offered the opportunity to use them, I replied. They were redistributed without my knowledge to support social relationships that serve my family's business interests. The naked truth of the situation hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be denied or explained away. My parents had weaponized my grandmother's jewelry, using pieces that held deep sentimental value for me as tools for social advancement. This is inappropriate dinner conversation, my mother said with forced authority, trying to reassert control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her management capabilities. What's inappropriate is the way you've treated me, I shot back. What's inappropriate is asking me to accept diminished status in my own family to make your business deal more comfortable. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat carefully, his medical training probably providing some experience with family crisis situations. Perhaps we should take a brief break from dinner to allow everyone to collect themselves, he suggested diplomatically. That won't be necessary, I replied. Daniel and I are leaving. The declaration sent shockwaves around the table, with everyone processing the implications of our departure at different speeds. Victoria immediately shifted into lawyer mode, recognizing a situation that needed immediate damage control. Amanda, you're being overly dramatic. Sit down and let's discuss this rationally. I've been trying to discuss this rationally for years, I replied, my voice steadier than I'd ever heard it. I've been accommodating, understanding, and endlessly patient with treatment that no self-respecting person should accept, but I'm done now. Daniel stood beside me, his presence providing strength I hadn't known I needed. We'll get our things and go. You can't leave on Christmas Eve, my mother said, her voice carrying genuine distress for the first time all weekend. What will people think? People will think that you raised a daughter who finally learned to value herself enough to walk away from situations that diminish her worth. As Daniel and I headed toward the door, I turned back to address the Pierce family directly. Dr. and Mrs. Pierce, I apologize for disrupting your evening. You seem like genuinely kind people, and you deserve to know that the family unity you've been admiring this weekend is entirely artificial. My parents have spent years teaching me to accept less than I deserve so they could maintain appearances that serve their social and business ambitions. Mrs. Pierce looked stricken, her gaze moving between the bracelet on her wrist and my family's horrified expressions. I don't understand, she said quietly. The jewelry you're wearing belonged to my grandmother who died when I was 12. It was given to you not out of generosity, but because my mother decided that maintaining social relationships with people like you was more important than preserving family connections with people like me. The weight of this revelation settled, over the dining room like a physical presence. Mrs. Pierce's hand moved to unclasp the bracelet, but I stopped her with a gesture. "Keep it," I said. "It suits you better than it ever suited me. And it serves as a perfect symbol of what my family values most." As Daniel and I left the dining room, I could hear the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a lengthy conversation about damage control and relationship repair. But for the first time in years, I didn't care about the aftermath of my choices. We packed quickly in the basement, throwing our belongings into bags with the efficiency of people who'd been mentally preparing for departure all weekend. As we carried our luggage toward the front door, my father intercepted us in the foyer. "Amanda, wait. Don't leave like this. We can work out whatever problems you're having. The problem is that you see my expectations of basic respect as problems to be worked out. You're my daughter. Of course you deserve respect. But you also have to understand that family relationships require compromise and consideration for others' needs." "I've been compromising for 28 years, I replied. "I've been so considerate of everyone else's needs that I forgot I had needs of my own." Robert's expression carried the desperate calculation of someone trying to salvage a deal that was falling apart beyond repair. "Think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences of leaving during Christmas, during such an important weekend for the family business." "I have thought about it, and I've decided that maintaining my dignity is more important than maintaining your business relationship." As we reached the front door, Victoria appeared with one final attempt at negotiation. "Amanda, please don't do anything irreversible. This weekend has been stressful for everyone, but we're still family. We can work through this. We could work through this if you were willing to acknowledge that the way you've treated me is wrong. But you're not. You're asking me to accept that this is how family members treat each other." "Family members support each other during important times," Victoria replied. "They put family interests ahead of personal grievances." "Personal grievances," I repeated. "Is that how you characterize being treated like an embarrassment in my own childhood home?" Victoria's expression shifted into the kind of controlled frustration she usually reserved for difficult opposing counsel. "You're choosing to destroy family relationships over seating arrangements and sleeping accommodations. Does that really seem proportional to you?" "I'm choosing to stop accepting mistreatment disguised as family love. The fact that you can't tell the difference is exactly why I need to leave." Daniel opened the front door, cold December air rushing into the warm foyer like a physical representation of the choice we were making. Outside, snow was falling more heavily now, coating the perfectly manicured landscape in pristine white. "Don't contact me unless you're prepared to acknowledge what's been happening and commit to genuine change," I said as we stepped onto the front porch. "I'm done pretending that this dysfunction is normal or acceptable." As we loaded our bags into Daniel's car, I could see faces at various windows, family members and guests trying to understand what had just happened to their carefully orchestrated Christmas Eve celebration. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked as we drove away from the house where I'd grown up. "I think so," I replied, surprised to discover that this was true. "I think I'm better than okay." We drove through Millbrook's quiet streets, past decorated houses where other families were presumably celebrating Christmas Eve with genuine warmth and connection. The contrast between those welcoming homes and the cold performance we'd just escaped felt like a revelation about what family celebration could actually mean. My phone began buzzing with texts and calls, but I turned it off without reading any of them. Whatever guilt, anger, or manipulation was being deployed in response to our departure could wait until I was ready to address it on my own terms. As we reached the highway that would take us away from Millbrook and back to our own life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The freedom that comes from finally choosing self-respect over family approval. It wasn't until the next morning, Christmas Day, that I would discover just how dramatically this choice would transform not only my relationship with my family, but the entire foundation of everything I thought I knew about the Rivers family legacy. Christmas morning arrived with an unexpected tranquility. Daniel and I had driven straight to his family's house in Springfield, where his mother Carmen had welcomed us with the kind of unconditional warmth that asked no questions about our sudden appearance on Christmas Eve. Their small but cozy home felt more welcoming than the Rivers mansion had ever been, filled with the sounds of genuine laughter and the aroma of traditional Cuban pastries. I woke up on their comfortable guest room bed to the sound of children playing in the backyard, Daniel's nieces and nephews already outside building snowmen despite the early hour. Through the window, I watched them work together with the kind of natural cooperation that comes from families where love isn't conditional on performance. My phone, which I'd finally turned back on, showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages from various family members. The progression of messages told a predictable story: initial anger, followed by guilt attempts, then veiled threats about consequences, and finally what appeared to be genuine panic from my mother. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, emerging from the bathroom already dressed for the day. "About leaving? None whatsoever," I replied with a certainty that surprised me. "I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time in years." Carmen Martinez appeared in our doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the warm smile that had made me feel immediately accepted the first time Daniel brought me home. "Buenos dias, mi amor," she said, handing me a steaming mug. "Merry Christmas. How are you feeling this morning?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. "Thank you for welcoming us so late last night." "Family always has a place here," she replied simply. "No matter what time, no matter what circumstances, that's what family means." The contrast between her unconditional acceptance and my own family's elaborate requirements for belonging couldn't have been more stark. Carmen had known me for 2 years and had never once suggested I needed to change, improve, or modify myself to deserve inclusion in their family circle. After breakfast, while Daniel helped his father Miguel prepare the traditional Christmas lunch, I found myself in their small living room surrounded by the cheerful chaos of a large, extended family celebration. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends filled every available seat, their conversations flowing in easy mixtures of Spanish and English. No one asked about my career in ways that suggested disapproval. No one evaluated my clothing or questioned my life choices. I was simply accepted as Daniel's girlfriend, someone who belonged because someone they loved had chosen to love me. It was while helping Carmen in the kitchen that my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have ignored unknown callers, but something prompted me to answer. "Miss Rivers, this is Margaret Sullivan from Sullivan and Associates. I apologize for calling on Christmas Day, but I've been trying to reach you for several weeks regarding your grandfather's estate." The mention of Grandpa Harold sent a jolt through me. I'd assumed all estate matters had been concluded months ago, with whatever modest inheritance he'd left distributed according to his wishes. "I'm sorry. There must be some mistake. My grandfather's estate was settled shortly after his death, in June." "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Miss Rivers. The initial distribution covered only a small portion of your grandfather's assets. The bulk of his estate was held in a private trust that required specific conditions to be met before final distribution could occur." I stepped away from the kitchen's holiday bustle, moving into Carmen's small study where I could hear more clearly. "What kind of conditions?" "Without going into details over the phone, I can tell you that those conditions have now been satisfied, and we need to meet as soon as possible to discuss your inheritance. Are you available to come to our office this week?" "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm confused. My family told me that Grandpa Harold's estate was modest, mostly personal effects and a small savings account." The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough to suggest I'd said something significant. "Miss Rivers, I think it would be best if we discussed this in person. Your grandfather's estate is substantial." The delay in contacting you was due to specific instructions he left regarding the timing and circumstances of this inheritance. Can you come in tomorrow morning? My mind reeled as I tried to process this information. Harold Rivers had been comfortable but not wealthy by Millbrook standards. He'd lived modestly, driven an older car, and seemed to spend most of his money on charitable causes rather than accumulating visible assets. How substantial are we talking about? Miss Rivers, your grandfather's estate is valued at approximately $45 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $45 million. The kind of money that transformed lives, that represented generational wealth, that would make the Pierce family's business partnership look modest by comparison. That's impossible. My grandfather wasn't wealthy enough to leave that kind of money. Your grandfather was extraordinarily private about his financial affairs. He built his wealth through careful investments over several decades, but he lived well below his means and avoided ostentatious displays of prosperity. The trust was structured to ensure his wealth would go to family members who shared his values, rather than those who might exploit it for social positioning. As Margaret Sullivan explained the basic structure of the trust, I began to understand why this information was reaching me now, on Christmas Day, after I'd finally found the courage to walk away from my family's conditional acceptance. The trust includes specific provisions about how potential heirs demonstrate their character and priorities, she continued. Your grandfather was very concerned that his wealth not corrupt family relationships or enable the kind of superficial social climbing he observed in many wealthy families. What kind of provisions? Beneficiaries had to show evidence of financial independence, commitment to meaningful work, and the ability to maintain personal integrity despite family pressure to compromise their values. There was also a requirement that they demonstrate genuine caring for others, particularly those less fortunate. Every criterion she mentioned seemed designed specifically for me, as if Grandpa Harold had crafted the trust requirements around the life I'd chosen, rather than the one my family had wanted me to pursue. Miss Rivers, are you still there? Yes, I'm sorry. This is just overwhelming. You're saying my grandfather left me $45 million? The trust names you as the primary beneficiary, with specific provisions about how the money should be used to continue his charitable work and support causes he cared about. There are other family members mentioned in the document, but the bulk of the estate was always intended for you. After scheduling a meeting for the following morning, I sat in Carmen's study trying to absorb the magnitude of what I'd just learned. My grandfather, the man who'd encouraged my career choice and celebrated my relationship with Daniel, had quietly amassed a fortune large enough to transform not just my life, but the lives of countless people I could help. More importantly, he'd structured his bequest in a way that validated every choice my family had criticized, every value they'd dismissed as impractical or naive. Daniel found me there an hour later, staring out the window at his nieces and nephews still playing in the snow. Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I explained Margaret Sullivan's call, watching his expression shift from confusion to amazement as the implications became clear. $45 million, he repeated slowly. Your grandfather was secretly wealthy this entire time? Apparently, he made a fortune through investments but chose to live modestly, and he left almost everything to me. Daniel sank into the chair beside me, clearly struggling to process this information. Does your family know about this? I don't think so. Mrs. Sullivan made it sound like the trust was completely separate from the estate they handled. My parents probably have no idea this money exists. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to understand how this revelation would change everything about my relationship with my family and my own sense of identity. What are you thinking? Daniel asked finally. I'm thinking about all the times they made me feel like a burden, like I wasn't contributing enough to the family legacy, I'm thinking about how they've spent years treating me like an embarrassment while sitting on the belief that Grandpa Harold was just a nice old man with modest means. My phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. Amanda, please call me. We need to talk about last night. The family is very concerned about your state of mind. The message would have triggered guilt and anxiety just 24 hours earlier. Now, with the knowledge of my grandfather's trust, it seemed almost comically irrelevant. Are you going to tell them? Daniel asked. Eventually. But first I want to understand exactly what Grandpa Harold intended. What obligations come with this inheritance, and how I can honor his memory while maintaining the boundaries I finally set last night. The meeting with Margaret Sullivan, the CID, next morning revealed even more surprising details about my grandfather's secret financial life. Her law office in New Haven was elegant but understated, much like Harold himself had been. Your grandfather began seriously accumulating wealth in his 30s, she explained, reviewing thick files that documented decades of careful investment decisions. He had a remarkable talent for identifying undervalued companies and holding investments long enough to see substantial returns. Why didn't he ever mention this to the family? Margaret's expression suggested she'd been anticipating this question. He was deeply concerned about how wealth might affect family relationships. He'd observed too many families torn apart by inheritance disputes, children competing for parental approval based on expected financial benefits, and wealth being used as a tool for manipulation and control. The description sounded uncomfortably familiar, given my own family's dynamics around social status and financial positioning. He was particularly worried about your parents' focus on appearance and social climbing, Margaret continued carefully. He felt that immediate access to significant wealth might enable behaviors he found troubling. What kind of behaviors? Using money to purchase social acceptance rather than earning it through character and contribution. Treating family members differently based on their perceived usefulness to social or business advancement. Prioritizing material success over meaningful relationships. Each item on her list perfectly described patterns I'd observed in my family for years, behaviors I'd assumed were normal until I started spending time with families like Daniel's, who operated according to completely different values. The trust was structured to ensure his wealth would go to someone who had already demonstrated independence, integrity, and genuine concern for others, Margaret explained. Someone who wouldn't be corrupted by sudden financial power or use it to enable the kind of superficial lifestyle he found distasteful. As she outlined the specific terms of the inheritance, I began to understand the full scope of what Grandpa Harold had envisioned. The money came with expectations about charitable giving, requirements for financial transparency, and obligations to continue funding causes he'd supported quietly for decades. There's one more thing, Margaret said, consulting her notes. Your grandfather left specific instructions about when and how other family members should be informed about this inheritance. He wanted you to have time to adjust to your new circumstances before dealing with what he anticipated would be significant pressure from relatives who had previously dismissed your life choices. How long do I have? The trust recommends waiting at least 6 months before making any major announcements or decisions about sharing information with family members. Your grandfather felt this would give you time to establish proper financial management systems and decide how you want to handle relationships going forward. 6 months to absorb the reality of generational wealth. 6 months to decide how this inheritance would change my relationship with family members who had spent years making me feel like a disappointment. 6 months to figure out how to honor Grandpa Harold's memory while protecting myself from the manipulation and exploitation he'd worked so hard to prevent. The irony was almost overwhelming. My family had spent Christmas weekend treating me like an embarrassment, excluding me from meaningful participation in their social performance, literally giving away my grandmother's jewelry to strangers they deemed more worthy of family heirlooms. And throughout all of this, I'd been sitting on an inheritance that dwarfed any wealth they'd ever imagined. But Grandpa Harold's legacy came with wisdom as well as money. He'd understood that true security came from character rather than capital, that meaningful relationships required authenticity rather than performance, and that the most important inheritance he could leave was the example of how to live with integrity despite external pressures. Over the following weeks, I found myself settling into a routine that felt more authentic than anything I'd experienced in years. I returned to my work at the Hartford Community Center with renewed energy, knowing that I now had resources to expand programs and provide opportunities for my clients that had previously been impossible. The teenagers I worked with noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. Marcus, who'd been kicked out by his family for being gay, asked if I'd won the lottery because I seemed so much happier and more confident. Something like that, I told him, already mentally planning how I could use my inheritance to create transitional housing for LGBTQ youth aging out of foster care. My family's attempts to contact me continued sporadically, but the tone of their messages shifted over time. Initial anger gave way to confusion, then concern, and finally what appeared to be genuine worry about my absence from their lives. Victoria's texts evolved from accusatory to pleading. "Amanda, please call me back. I know I handled things poorly, but we're family. We need to work this out." My mother's voicemails became increasingly emotional. "Sweetheart, I've been thinking about our conversation, and maybe we haven't been as sensitive to your feelings as we should have been. Please come home so we can talk." Even my father, who rarely expressed personal emotions, left a message that suggested genuine self-reflection. "Amanda, I've been reviewing how we handled Christmas weekend, and I recognize that we may have made some mistakes. Your happiness is more important than any business deal." But I wasn't ready to engage with their newfound concern. The sudden shift in their behavior felt reactive rather than genuine, motivated by the social embarrassment of my dramatic departure, rather than authentic recognition of how they'd treated me. It was Daniel who finally convinced me to at least read their messages rather than deleting them automatically. "I'm not saying you should forgive them or go back to accepting their treatment," he said one evening as we cooked dinner in our Hartford apartment. "But maybe understanding their perspective could help you decide how you want to handle things going forward." That night, I finally listened to all the voicemails and read through the accumulated text messages. The progression was revealing, showing a family slowly beginning to confront the possibility that they'd fundamentally misjudged both the situation and my character. The most surprising message came from Mrs. Pierce, who had somehow obtained my number and left a voicemail that I replayed several times. "Amanda, this is Eleanor Pierce. I wanted to reach out personally to apologize for my role in what happened on Christmas Eve. After you left, your mother explained more about the family jewelry situation, and I realized I'd been completely inappropriate in accepting pieces that clearly belonged to you. I've returned the bracelet to your mother, and I wanted you to know that my husband and I were very impressed by your integrity and your commitment to helping vulnerable young people. If you're ever interested in discussing potential support for your work, we'd be honored to explore how we might contribute to such important causes." The message revealed that my confrontation had created ripple effects beyond my immediate family, forcing everyone present to reconsider assumptions about family dynamics and individual worth. 3 months after Christmas, I finally agreed to meet with my parents, not at their house, which would have given them home field advantage, but at a neutral restaurant in Hartford where I felt comfortable and confident. They arrived looking nervous and uncertain, a stark contrast to their usual commanding presence. My mother had dressed down for the occasion, wearing simple clothes that suggested she was trying to signal respect for my lifestyle rather than imposing her own standards. "Amanda," she said as they approached my table, "thank you for agreeing to see us." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with my parents. For the first time in my memory, they listened more than they spoke, asking questions about my perspective rather than defending their own positions. "We've been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas," my father said carefully, "about how we've treated you, about what we've prioritized as a family, about what really matters in the long run. Dr. Pierce actually gave us some perspective we hadn't considered, my mother added. He pointed out that the way we'd described your work didn't match what we witnessed at dinner, that you clearly had a depth of commitment and expertise we hadn't acknowledged. Their newfound appreciation felt genuine, but also somewhat beside the point. I didn't need their validation of my career choices, though it was interesting to hear them finally express something resembling respect for my professional life. What do you want from this conversation? I asked directly. My parents exchanged glances before my father answered. We want to understand how to rebuild our relationship with you. We want to learn how to be better family members, better parents. We realize we've been measuring success by the wrong standards. The admission was more than I'd ever expected to hear from Robert Rivers, but I wasn't ready to simply accept their repentance and return to family functions as if nothing had happened. Rebuilding requires acknowledging specifically what was wrong with how you treated me, I said. It means understanding that I won't accept conditional love or respect based on whether my choices serve your social or business interests. Over the course of a 2-hour conversation, we began the slow process of establishing new boundaries and expectations. They agreed to treat Daniel with genuine respect rather than polite tolerance. They committed to including me in family decisions, rather than simply informing me of arrangements they'd made. Most importantly, they promised to stop using guilt and manipulation to enforce compliance with their preferences. There's something else, my mother said as our meeting was winding down. About your grandmother's jewelry. Mrs. Pierce returned the bracelet, and I wanted you to know that all of your grandmother's pieces are being held for you. I should have offered them to you years ago. The gesture felt meaningful, though I suspected the jewelry had already become symbolic of larger issues that couldn't be resolved simply through returning material objects. As spring turned into summer, my relationship with my family slowly began to rebuild on a more authentic foundation. Victoria and I had several difficult but productive conversations about her role in excluding me from family activities. She eventually acknowledged that her legal training had made her skilled at finding rational justifications for emotionally driven decisions. I convinced myself that marginalizing you was strategic rather than cruel, she admitted during one of our phone calls. I told myself I was protecting the family's interests rather than protecting my own insecurities about whether I really deserved my position. These conversations revealed that my sister's seemingly confident dominance of family dynamics had masked significant anxiety about maintaining her status as the successful daughter. My mere existence had threatened her position by suggesting that alternative paths might be equally valid. By the time 6 months had passed since Christmas, I felt ready to share the news about Grandpa Harold's inheritance. I called a family meeting at my parents' house. The same dining room where I'd experienced my public humiliation now serving as the venue for a very different kind of revelation. I have something important to tell you about Grandpa Harold's estate, I began, noting their immediate attention and concern. As I explained the trust, the inheritance amount, and Harold's specific intentions, I watched their expressions shift through confusion, amazement, and something that looked like profound regret. $45 million, Victoria repeated, slowly. He was sitting on that kind of wealth the entire time? He was waiting to see which family members would demonstrate the values he thought were important, I replied. Independence, integrity, concern for others, the ability to resist pressure to compromise personal principles. The implications hung in the air as everyone processed how their treatment of me looked in light of this new information. They'd spent years dismissing my choices and excluding me from family importance while I was actually the primary beneficiary of the family's largest financial asset. Amanda, my father said finally, I need you to know that we're not trying to rebuild our relationship because of this inheritance. The money doesn't change our regret about how we treated you. I know, I replied, and I did believe him. The Conversations we've had over the past months have been about much more than money. They've been about learning to value people for who they are, rather than what they can provide. As news of my inheritance spread through Millbrook's social circles, I watched with fascination as people who had previously dismissed or ignored me suddenly discovered my remarkable qualities and potential. Invitations to social events multiplied. Board positions were offered, and my phone rang with calls from people who wanted to discuss charitable partnerships. But Grandpa Harold's wisdom had prepared me for this kind of attention. I'd learned to distinguish between people who valued my character and those who were attracted to my newly revealed financial assets. The inheritance allowed me to expand my work in ways I'd never imagined possible. I established a foundation focused on supporting LGBTQ youth, created a scholarship program for kids aging out of foster care, and funded innovative programs that addressed root causes of family breakdown, rather than simply managing its consequences. Daniel and I used some of the money to buy a house, but we chose a modest home in Hartford, rather than relocating to Millbrook's prestigious neighborhoods. We wanted to remain part of the community where we'd built authentic relationships rather than moving into circles where wealth was the primary credential for inclusion. My family's transformation continued gradually over the following year. They began making different choices about social priorities, spending more time on substantive activities and less energy on impression management. Victoria left her corporate law firm to work for a nonprofit focused on legal advocacy for vulnerable populations. My parents started attending St. Matthew's Church again and became genuinely involved in community service activities. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how we related to each other. Family gatherings became smaller and more intimate, focused on genuine connection rather than social performance. Conversations involved real interest in each other's lives rather than competitive displays of achievement. This Christmas, exactly 1 year after the dramatic confrontation that had changed everything, we celebrated quietly at my parents' house. With just immediate family. No business associates, no social pressure, no elaborate performances designed to impress anyone. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings, and Victoria insisted I use the returned bracelet as well. But this time, wearing family jewelry felt like claiming my rightful inheritance, rather than being granted temporary access to items that really belonged to someone more worthy. As we sat around the same dining room table where I'd once been, relegated to distant seating, I reflected on how completely our family dynamic had transformed. Not because of the money, though that had certainly provided security and options, but because we'd finally learned to value authenticity over appearance, character over status, and genuine connection over strategic relationships. Grandpa Harold had given me far more than financial wealth. He'd given me the example of how to live with integrity, the courage to demand respect from people who claim to love me, and the wisdom to understand that true inheritance isn't about money, but about values that can transform generations. That evening, as Daniel and I drove home through streets lined with houses where other families were celebrating their own Christmas traditions, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept anything less than genuine love and respect from the people who matter most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.